little bit about um, what he wants to do to take it forward. And also, he's most welcome to intervene and ask questions because we really are trying to provide him with a grounded information that would allow him to um, take that forward into COP26 next year. Now, we have two very distinguished panels. The first panel, I won't go through the names right now. I'll introduce them when we have the panels. But please do answer the second question in the Mentimeter at the moment. It's what type of organization do you work for? And to give us a sense of which are the organizations that we have. And the first panel, I will be asking them to address the issue of barriers to supporting locally led adaptation with the most vulnerable communities. And many of them have a lot of experience working with vulnerable communities and have information to share with us on that experience. And then the second panel, after a break, and we'll do a little bit of a Mentimeter exercise then, will be looking at finance. We know that finance is a critical input, that everybody needs money. But the first round, we won't talk about finance. We will come to finance in the second round. And so we have a good representation of 14 civil society organizations, 6 research organizations, 6 intergovernmental organizations, a couple of grassroots organizations, a couple of government, and a couple of private sectors. So a good mix of non-governmental actors with a preponderance of NGOs. So we hope we'll have a good discussion going forward. So without further ado, let me now invite, I should also mention, which I neglected to do, that this is organized jointly by the Global Resilience Partnership, GRP, together with the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. And it's supported by the 2 high-level champions from Chile and the UK. And we're very fortunate to have with us the UK's high-level champion, Nigel Topping. And so I will now invite our first speaker to sort of lay the scene for South Asia. Sanjay, if you'd like to take the floor and share your thoughts with us.
Sure. Thank you, Salim. Thanks for the opportunity. Hi, Prematai, Manjeet, Lajana. I know all of you, most of you, Ghulam, Muktabhai. Well, thanks for the opportunity. Basically, I just want to start with one word which we are hearing in most of the stories about impacts: unprecedented. That's the mantra. I mean, it's 2020, 2019, 2018. I went through many stories about disasters, extreme events that's taking place, and every year I hear unprecedented, which is happening. The temperature in South Asia is somewhere between 1.5 to 3 degree increase has been observed in many places, and as a result, we see Karachi floods, 230 mm in 12 hours. That's the rainfall, and 189 people killed. Then Mumbai floods, 294 mm in rainfall in 12 hours, 332 mm in 24 hours. While as per the IMD, they say that any rainfall which is more than 204 mm is considered to be extremely heavy. Extremely heavy is the highest. So even it is the rain floods are being caused because of heavy rainfalls, which has never been imagined will take place. Bay of Bengal, Amphan impacted Bangladesh and India. 3 million evacuated, 13 million were affected in 2 countries. Recovery is still going on. 1.5 million households were damaged in Amphan. Nisarga, strongest tropical cyclone. Arabian Sea, we never used to see cyclones. Now that phenomena has started. Losses of around 65 million US dollars. And Amphan is also, Nisarga is also considered as such an extreme cyclone since 1891 in Maharashtra, 1891 in Maharashtra. Bangladesh floods in Cox's Bazar and Satkhira, thousands displaced. Nepal floods and landslides in mountain country. It's also the landslides after floods, flash floods, and then landslides also affect the infrastructure. Kerala floods is become a normal now. We never heard, we heard about Kerala floods 2 years back, and everyone was under panic. God's own country was affected, and now Kerala flood is happening, and now it's normal. We know, oh, that has happened earlier also. And then heat waves, and this is going on. I just mentioned about 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017. The frequency of disasters have gone up. The intensity has gone up. We are seeing it. I just quoted some examples, and the loss is not only on infrastructure. Loss is also of lives, which are irrecoverable. We loses so much, even our coping capacity, when we try to overcome the impact that we are seeing. So not a single year is normal now. And while in last a decade or so in South Asia, our normal become a new, or I would say, our new normal is basically natural disaster frequency plus climate change, which is increasing the intensity and frequency. So we accepted it. We were fine with it. We said, okay, we are adding resilient capacity, we are adding adaptation capacity, and we can cope up, and we'll be able to make it possible. This year, COVID, COVID has hit us, which actually compromised our coping capacity. Whatever resilient we built, that was hit in this year, and the truth came out that any such kind of disasters will impact the whatever efforts we have made so far. Disaster risk reduction fraternity is overstretched. Work on long-term resilience is affected. Reverse migration has happened. It is estimated more around 200 million people have returned back to their homes because of lockdown in South Asian countries. And what does that mean? That means they didn't have any jobs. Their economic capacity has gone down. They've lost jobs. Of course, we all know the economies are contracting in many South Asian countries, and people are living on edges. When we speak about building resilience and adaptation in South Asia, these are the challenges. The challenge is much bigger, and I'm really glad that all civil society and all actors are coming together from South Asia to find ways on how to enhance our efforts towards it. What needs to be done? I have only 5 minutes. So what needs to be done? My starting point would be Paris Agreement, where global goal on adaptation stipulates 3 pillars for adaptation that needs to be done. We need to build adaptive capacity. We need to strengthen our long-term resilience. And when I say long-term resilience, also take in account the threat we can face, sudden threat, which no one would anticipate, but can come up, we can face like COVID, and also reduce our vulnerabilities. And when I say reduce our vulnerabilities, in terms of all aspects. And the systems that are required are natural systems that is required, social cohesion is required, physical capacity is required, financial capacity is required, and human resources are required. So skills are also important. And I'm really glad that the next 2 hours are actually dedicated towards locally led adaptation, which I do hope the panel will discuss about what kind of natural capacity, natural resources need to be maintained or conserved, what kind of social cohesion, what kind of social processes need to be put in place so that communities come together to mitigate the impact of extreme disasters, what kind of physical infrastructure need to be built, what kind of human resources are required, and the most important is the energy in all these systems, which is finance, how finance need to be mobilized, and there will be one panel on that also. I do hope that all these systems, the findings that we will have will help us to reduce our exposure and our sensitivity towards climate impacts. So I'll be participating and I'll be contributing more. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay, for that very excellent overview of the critical situation in this region. I, in fact, personally feel very strongly that the evidence is now absolutely unequivocal that the year 2020 is not just the year of COVID-19, but it is also the tipping point of climate change. We are now in a climate changed, past tense world. It's happening. It's human-induced climate change. Impacts are happening, and we now cannot escape that. And every year from now on, it's going to get worse. Not going to get better. It's going to get worse. And we are really not prepared for that. So something for us to keep in mind as we go forward. It's now my pleasure to introduce and invite Nigel Topping, the UK's high-level climate champion, to give us a few sort of words of what you're seeking from this meeting. And perhaps later on, we can get your reflections after you've heard some of us speak. Nigel, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Salim, and thank you, Sanjay, for that kind of robust description of the problem. I find myself in this role of high-level champion, feeling a great burden of responsibility, and you've just highlighted why. This is a problem now that is causing real economic and human suffering all over the world, but particularly in vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries. So in a sense, if we stopped the dialogue now, you would have achieved one thing, which is just to remind me at a human level of just how great the responsibility we share to do something. So thank you for that. I want to say greet to everybody. This is the second of the regional resilience dialogues that my fellow high-level action champion Gonzalo Munoz and I are holding. Gonzalo sends his apologies. He would have loved to join you, but it's 4 a.m. in Chile, so I'm sure you'll forgive him for not joining us. I will update him. I would like to thank the International Centre for Climate Change and Development and the Huayru Commission for convening the dialogue, and to the Global Resilience Partnership and all the members of the Resilience Network of the Marrakesh Partnership. I think most of you know what the High-Level Climate Action Champion's job is, but for those of you who don't, just very briefly, the role was created in Paris to be appointed for 2 COP cycles by each COP presidency. Hence, I work alongside Gonzalo, who was appointed by the Chilean presidency, to work with non-state actors, so businesses, cities, civil society, to raise ambition and drive action on climate. Gonzalo and I have launched a big campaign to try and accelerate action on mitigations called the Race to Zero. It's going really well. We're very aware that historically mitigation has received more attention and more emphasis than adaptation and resilience. Hence these dialogues. And we're committed to launching a big campaign to raise awareness and the pace of action on resilience in the months to come. And so this is one of the main objectives for me of this dialogue, is to inform me and Gonzalo and the Marrakesh partners how we can construct that in a way which really helps us build momentum. And of course, we can't talk about the need for action on resilience to the effects of climate change without acknowledging that there's a global climate justice issue, and that there's a particular issue of the need to act in the most vulnerable countries, which are predominantly in the global south. So I think the sort of litany of extreme effects that Sanjay has taken us through really highlights that. So we're also very committed to extending our work in the global south. And for example, we've historically, the high-level champions haven't had much support. So Gonzalo and I have built a much stronger team now. We have a good base in Latin America, which is where Gonzalo is from, and in Europe, where I'm from. So one of the things we're committed to through the next year is to actually build a support network that's global. So in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, so that when the UK presidency and my role as champion is over, we don't lose momentum. So we don't have a big push when the UK and I've got the presidency, but we want to make sure that when I work with an African champion for COP27, we can continue the momentum that we've built. So we're trying to build for the long term, not just spike for COP26, because this is not a 12-month challenge, as you all know. We're really, so 3 things that I'm really looking for help on. One is we're really trying to take a systems approach. We know that these challenges we face, first of all, mitigation and resilience are not separate things. They're often, they're everything's interconnected. We know that, right? So, but second of all, there's no silver bullets. There's no one actor can solve anything. It's not just grassroots or just government or just private sector. So we're really trying to understand systemically how do we really work together as the whole of society to move forward. So that's one thing I'm looking for, is what are those linkages that are working or that are not working that need to be connected. The second is, it feels like there's a very simple narrative around mitigation. It's one number and it needs to get to zero. So it's a little bit like the simplicity of GDP, which is beguiling but misleading. That we know that if we only focus on GDP, we get more GDP, but it doesn't mean we get better human development outcomes, because it's a kind of weird measure. So we have to think more holistically, and I think resilience is much more of a holistic concept and need than mitigation. So we have to work a bit harder with our language around it. So you'll hear me trying to avoid the phrase adaptation and resilience, because I know that's a really important phrase in the negotiations. But actually, I find that for normal human beings, when you juxtapose adaptation and resilience, it immediately is confusing. They seem to be similar ideas. Why has that phrase got such magic? So I'm trying to just use the word resilience, which seems more understandable at a human level. It's about health, right? So I think we all understand that. So just to explain why I'm trying to favor a simpler narrative than the complex but necessary narrative within the context of the negotiations. And so I've been really, I'm really intrigued listening to you in just introductions to the panelists we had before. And I'm trying to find a simple narrative. When people say to me, what are you trying to do about resilience? I kind of think if we can't sum it up in three headlines, we're probably getting too complex. So I'll just be intrigued. I keep hearing that it's really about rural resilience and food systems, and particularly smallholder farmers. So resilient livelihoods, resilient food. Clearly about urban resilience, particularly when we talk about informal settlements and just how vulnerable they are. And then something I think about disaster risk reduction, disaster preparation, disaster recovery. As Sanjay was saying, things that were considered 100-year events now are just becoming normal. So, but we have to normalize our ability to cope with them, which is of course the adaptation piece. So I'm interested in the language that's emerging to simplify the way we talk about resilience, so that it can land with leaders in all sectors of society, so that it can draw them towards action rather than a language which becomes a barrier to action because it seems confusing. And the final point, of course, is about finance. And I'm particularly interested, again, systemically, how do we build the bridge between the massive numbers like the new climate economy? I think $6.9 trillion a year in infrastructure investment, just so big, so many zeros, we have to think about how to write it. And then the very tangible local needs, which are obviously very small in the context of 6.9 trillion, but is what has to happen to actually bring about change. So I'm really interested, how do we, particularly in the light of COVID, how do we develop a political narrative of investment, which is not just the 100 billion, which again, the 100 billion is absolutely essential. We all know that in terms of the commitments that were made and the trust in the multilateral system. But the 100 billion is not the solution. It's the 6.9 trillion, or do we even agree on that number? So I'm interested in how do we build a narrative which mobilizes global politics in the context of COVID into an international Build Back Better financing push, not just national Green New Deals in the developed world. We're leaving a big question about whether it's the 200 million people returning that Sanjay mentions, or the big risk of similar numbers of people falling back into extreme poverty if we don't manage the global recovery well. So systems view, getting the language right to engage, and the kind of geopolitics of financing the green resilient recovery. I have to say that the first session I had with similar colleagues of yours from Southeast Asia was both humbling and inspiring, and I'm deeply impressed by all of your commitment to doing this crucial work, and really looking forward to learning in the next 2 hours. Thank you, Salim.
Great. Thank you very much, Nigel, for that excellent framing of what you're seeking from us. So let me start with a little bit of a housekeeping, and then I will move to the first panel of speakers. So we are going to be running the Mentimeter as we go along, and invite you to put in your answers to the questions that we have, which the first set of questions are what barriers and challenges there are in supporting local action from your own line of work, and we will capture all of these in our final report. You're also welcome to use the chat box to put in comments, questions. We'll try and address the questions if we can, if we have time, but we'll keep them in the record nevertheless, so that Nigel and Gonzalo, the two high-level champions, get that and receive that so that they will have access to it. So before I invite the first set of speakers to talk about the challenges and barriers, let me just frame a little bit for Nigel's benefit how we went about organizing this particular regional session. We had quite a lot of discussions amongst the organizing partners, and we felt the overall theme from our perspective was focusing on the most vulnerable communities and what we sort of in the jargon term call locally led adaptation. But it is very much, and the speakers have been selected for that very purpose, people who have a lot of experience working with vulnerable communities, both in the urban sector as well as in the rural sector and across the region. And what we've invited them to do, and I'll introduce them one by one in a minute, is to share a little bit of their experience, but not too much. Each of them can talk for an hour about what they do and how they work. We've asked them to keep that very, very short, but focus more on what they've learned about the barriers and challenges and what they think needs to be done. So it's very much speaking to you on the basis of their lived experience of working with, trying to help the most vulnerable communities wherever they live, but then seeing the problems that they are facing and giving advice on how those problems can be faced, addressed, and taken forward and solved, hopefully, over time. So let me start with the first panel and the first speaker, who is Prema Gopalan. Prema is the founder and executive director of Chayam Shikshan Prayog in India and has a long history of working with vulnerable communities in India. I would invite and request our speakers to stick to the 5 minutes if you can. And as I said, don't spend too much time describing what you do. Try to describe that quickly and then move to the solutions that you think need to be done, because we really want to do a forward-looking approach to this meeting and not just sharing knowledge and information and experience. Prema, please go ahead. You have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Prema Gopalan here. Swayam Shikshan Prayog is self-education for empowerment. We are located in India and we work through Asia and many continents with the Viro Commission network that seeks to empower women, grassroots women's groups in rural and urban communities. SSP for short works across 7 states in India. By choice, we work in climate-hit regions, whether it's floods, cyclones, and drought. Our women and communities have been facing crises as usual. So for the last 20 years, our repeat experiences in dealing with disasters and climate change have shown that women are at the front line, as we've seen after COVID-19, in response and recovery. And they are the best bet going forward as resilience builders and change makers. Having said that, I think the barriers that really are quite fundamental are that they are among the most affected rural and urban poor. They are located in the most vulnerable regions in South Asia. And as Sanjay elaborated, they are the hardest hit. But women see themselves as part of the solution not as part of the problem. And we should, I think, look at that very carefully, how we can get women to participate more widely. And the SSP experience shows that when we reposition women as economic, social, and political actors, over 200,000 women have been impacted across these states. In turn, they have reached out to more than 6.6 million people in India. Over 70,000 women not considered farmers, they're considered as labor, and that's part of the problem. We turned that problem on its head, and women got a piece of land from their families, and they have cultivated food crops, ensuring food and income security throughout the year, instead of cultivating high-cost cash crops. Similarly, women are now part of collective value chains going forward. And I would say this is one of my key messages, that South Asia is really rich with the experience of very organized women's groups, but they are treated as channels for microcredit. It's time that we look at more than 300 or 400 million women as change makers, and they've shown their leadership after COVID-19 in working with the local governments. Last week, the Indian government has mandated that if we have to reach the most vulnerable, then it's these women's self-help groups that will help us to do that. So to have a socially inclusive recovery and resilience, and particularly climate resilience, we also need to look at bridging women in these vulnerable groups and the communities themselves and institutions. So from the SSP experience, we had a finance company that was led, a community fund that is led by women, a skills and finance company, social and enterprise ecosystems. All these were needed in order to support women as entrepreneurs and in value chains. Now, these models can easily be scaled up, provided we have women as part of the formal place in the table, and beyond their voice, recognize them as part of the local planning and decision making. So my 3 takeaway points are: one, we need to look at regenerating economies. Women have already shown the way that you can create local markets and food economies. For this, they need access to flexible finance, and they need to access skills and resources like other entrepreneurs do. Second, my second point is that locally led action is really not business as usual. Climate innovations, whether in agriculture, water, and management of natural resources, require that the poor women are organized, which they are, and require that they get access to flexible finance, which the banks and government institutions are not really looking at now. So that's a big gap. And now you can add technology and digital skills to that basket. So otherwise, we will be really looking at an increasing digital divide. And as I said earlier, we have been amazed at the leadership of women in including all the vulnerable groups to get benefit access after COVID. Now, this needs to be part of long-term resilience planning, where we introduce gender budgeting, participation on decision-making platforms, and create these mechanisms, both from local to national and across.
Thank you.
So I would say, if there are any questions, I can go for it. Thanks, Salim.
Thank you very much,
thanks,
Prema. That was
Nigel.
excellent, excellent presentation. Let me just also, before I introduce our next speaker, for Nigel's benefit, mention that one of the things that we try to do in this session and invite people is to go beyond simply the narrative of victimhood, vulnerable people being affected, but also agency and action. And all the speakers that you are hearing from are involved in doing things. So the question now for us is, how do we scale up? They are scaling up to some extent, but it's not enough. And so really the challenge for all of us collectively, and you as our high-level champion, as much as the UK's high-level champion, we seek your support and guidance in taking us forward in terms of the scaling up of the many, many different and excellent initiatives that are taking place. So,
Salim,
yes,
if I just say, first of all, I'm appointed by the UKA, but my mandate is very clearly global. So please think of me as your high-level champion, not the UK's.
So we are now making you our high-level champion. Yeah, you can say that.
Yes,
I've endorsed.
that's my responsibility. And this was something which came across, this sense of not victims but agents was something which came across in the first dialogue with your Southeast Asian colleagues. And this is one of the things, I think this is one of the traps of focusing only on the 100 billion, is that it comes across outside of the negotiations as the only solution is the global South demanding more money from the global North, exactly. as though there's a sort of passive waiting for help. And I think we have to make sure that is not part of the narrative, that there's huge agency, huge resourcefulness, huge resilience, and there's a need for help. So
absolutely.
I'm pleased you mentioned that point. Thank you.
Exactly. So in fact, as you'll have seen, we've made the first panel not about money.
Yeah.
It's about doing things and finding ways of solidarity to address those things collectively. People, not money, people. And that really is to us more important than money, although money is important, and we'll come to it in the second panel. So let us now move from India to Nepal. And it's my pleasure to introduce Lajana Manandar, who is the Executive Director of the Lumanti Support Group for Shelter in Nepal. Lajana, if you could kindly share your thoughts, and if you wouldn't mind keeping within the 5-minute time limit, if you can. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try my best to keep it short. And namaste and hello to everyone. I'll try to be short, yes. It's great to hear Sanjay and Nigel and yourself. I mean, a global level context and a global level figures. When we come to know about it, it's actually very scary, so it's scary. But when we go to the communities and work with the vulnerable people, so we really think, small things, not the big things, like we're not aware about what is happening at the global or even at the national level policies and so on. But the small things that can actually make a difference in the lives of the poor people, I think that's what everybody would want to know. And then also you are also keen that how that can be scaled up. That is very important. And as a civil society organizations working with the poor communities for the last so many years, our effort has been actually to help the poor communities. So there is some activities. So there is some kind of actions that can actually build their resilience to absorb the shock and stresses from the climate change impact, from any other emergencies, earthquake in Nepal, and now this pandemic as well. So our effort has been to help the people to get organized. So one of the, I think, the kind of activities that we have been working, and we see that as a success also, is getting the communities, the poor communities, the vulnerable communities, and the women to get them organized, right? Organize them. So organizing means actually also to have an entry point into the decision-making process. So organizing, it's not just to get organized, but because if you are not organized, if you are an individual, you don't have access to the local governments, you don't have any place where you can actually have your voice heard or your say heard, or you can claim a space in any decision-making process. So that's why we actually got the women to get organized. We have actually established and registered 40 saving and credit cooperatives in different parts of the country. And there are about 38,000 women members, and they have saved $13 million US now in total, and that money is actually, they're actually borrowing the money in building resilience in their own life, benefiting themselves and their families, investing in livelihood, agriculture, health, education, so many things, infrastructure, so many things, right? So this is very, very important, I think, getting people organized and help them to get empowered. So the empowerment is actually, it may not be seen as a direct contributor to fight against all these disasters, to all the emergencies, but it is very important. Indirectly, it is a key factor that actually contributes, that actually build the self-confidence of the people to fight against such difficulties. If you are not empowered, you can't do anything. You can't actually face the disasters. There's no resiliency. But then empowerment is very important, and investment in empowerment is so critical, so important. That's what we are trying to do it bit. And also, like, this eco-friendly planning is also very, very important. That's what we actually do not see it, how the cities are perceiving, how they want to develop. They want to have a big infrastructures, everything big in the scale, but that may have a negative impact in the environment. That is not eco-friendly. So I think eco-friendly planning is very important, and the sensitizations among the local government officials, among the decision makers, is very important. That it's very important to have an eco-friendly planning, and also do some kind of like construction of infrastructures accordingly. We have actually supported the poor communities in the urban areas, also in the rural areas as well, like, to improve their housing conditions, to raise their houses, to have a higher platform, to raise to have a to have a, like, eco-friendly water and sanitation facilities, like construction of parks and conservation of water resources, conservation of ponds, wells, that actually contributes in recharging the groundwater, retaining wall, walking path, conservation of traditional water sources, stone spouts. This may look small things, but then in the communities, when we work with the communities, this is their priority, and that this is also, all these activities are contributing directly or indirectly in in fighting against disasters, emergencies, addressing the water shortage issues, and so many things. So these are all very, very important, and the investment is required in all these kind of activities. So the another important thing is, I'm also going to little bit talk about the financing mechanism, how we have also tried to mobilize the financing at the local level. At the local level, we have actually worked with the local governments in some municipalities, and then we have actually set up urban community support fund, where we have actually got the local government's influence to contribute in that urban poor support fund, and the money there can be invested for the sake of the community development, also to implement the agendas and actions as identified in LAPA as well, for the implementation of the local adaptation plan. So probably that is one of the way that how we can actually mobilize the finance at a local level as well. So the funding not going to the local level from the national level or from the global level coming to the poor countries, that may be a different things. I mean, that is a lot of advocacy, and that's a huge agendas. But when we work with the communities, we have to see what is available there, how we can actually maximize the resources available there. I mean, just advocating and just talking and just asking to give more resources is not going to help. How long we can help, how long the people can. So we have find the local solutions. So then, drawing from my experiences, I have actually 4 recommendations to make from all this. Opportunity should be provided for the women and the poor communities to get engaged in the process, to get in the plan, to get engaged in the process, and then empowerment of the people, empowerment of the community, youth groups, communities, women's, and also eco-friendly planning and sustainable financing mechanism for the implementation of LAPA is very, very important. So these are my 4 recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lajana. I know you can go on for a long time, and it's my sincere apologies for cutting you short. But I think you've made your points very well. I'll pick up a couple of them to highlight for Nigel's benefit. One of them is the fact that, in this region, urban populations and rural populations are not distinctive. There's a very strong continuum between urban, rural, people coming and going, And in also, the newest sort of global buzzword of nature-based solutions, which is now being used a lot, has a lot of resonance at the local level in more, traditional indigenous ways of working within the ecosystem that people live in. They don't call it nature-based solutions, but they practice it in their reality. And so, there is a lot to learn from that experience on the ground. And the examples that Lajana gave us from Nepal are some very good ones. And also, let me also commend the government of Nepal of being one of the pioneers in having what they call LAPAs, local adaptation plans of actions. Other countries have NAPAs. Nepal not only has a NAPA, it also has LAPAs. So every local constituency in Nepal has their own plans, and they get resourced by the national government to do them. A very, very innovative practice that we would like all countries to emulate if possible. So let me now move on to our third panelist in this session, which is going to be Ziaul Haq who's the General Secretary of the Campaign for Rural Livelihoods in Bangladesh. He's a very good friend of ours in Bangladesh, and as friends, we call him by his nickname, which is Mukta. And given that this is a meeting of friends, I will ask us to address him as Mukta. So Mukta, you have the floor. If you can make your points within 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. As I was discussing with colleagues at ICAT before, that they wanted me to focus a little on the youth people in the grassroots level. So Campaign for Sustainable Rural Livelihoods, it is a campaigning platform established in 2007. And currently it has been working in 3 local areas of Bangladesh. And among these 3, 2 are in the coastal region and the rest one is at floodplain. So from these 3 areas, I will draw my presentation, or I shall say, I will draw my speech here. The first one is since 2007, as we are working in those areas, recently we have focused on 2 major areas. Number 1 is the embankment management in the locality, particularly I shall say both in the coastal area as well as in the floodplain area. So the embankment management becomes one of the key area, as we have experienced particularly in 2009 that it took near about 2 years to reconstruct the embankment that was destructed by cyclones. Around 800,000 people were, displaced, and they had to live their life on the roadside, in different road and in different locality of the urban areas. However, the second areas of important, the areas that we are focusing on at this moment is local adaptation priorities. We have seen that many of the government projects are being implemented by different ministries, and they are not focusing on the local priorities. They are mostly focusing on different, I shall say, they are different priorities that serves their own bureaucratic, I shall say, interest. So from these 2 points, we are working mostly on embankment management at this moment and on local adaptation priorities. And our key platform in the local area is beyond our organization. We have formed Jalbayu Porishad, means climate associates or something like that. They are, as a civil society platform, they are working in the locality. And as part of this civil society platform, Jalbayu Porishad, they have formed some kind of youth platform in their locality. Around 20 boys and girls, they are working as youth in the locality, and they are providing different kinds of support to the local people. And they are supporting a lot, they are providing their support a lot to the Jalbayu Porishad. They are actually discuss with different groups of people and provide different kinds of options for the government officials, local governments for implementation. They are very visible in the local administration level, and they are with people. We are also trying to connect them with the national level organizations as well as local level organizations in their locality. And I shall say that we are developing their leadership so that they can uphold the issues of the local level. So I shall say that during the COVID period, they are mostly providing their support to the community on monitoring and awareness related issues. They are discussing with different communities on COVID related other issues. Particularly, they are focusing mostly on the gender-based violence during the COVID issue. And they are informing this gender-based violence to the Jalbayu Parishad as well as to the local administration. I am not sharing any case study here to shorten my speech here. So these are how we are working with them. One challenge we feel while we are working with the local youth, that they are actually learning by doing only, and we don't have any kind of financial support for them to implement their task. I'm not talking about payment for them. I'm talking about the expenses to implement the task at the grassroots level. So if there is financing mechanism, I think that the financing mechanism in the future should provide some kind of a space to the youth groups at the locality so that they can have some kinds of financial support to implement the task, not as their salary. So at last point, I would like to go beyond what I was asked to tell. And here I will focus on what Nigel mentioned in his point 2, particularly on development and other GDP and other issues. So I shall say that the human civilization by this time has developed a lot of great experiences and they have placed those before us for consideration. Particularly, I would like to say, number one, the Human Development Index of the UNDP. This is a great initiative. This narration as well as in the annex, the way they have placed the Human Development Index, this is something we need to focus a lot in our development thinking. Number 2, I would like to focus on what the Most Vulnerable Forum has done in the past, particularly when they developed the Vulnerability Index. This is what we also need to think about, and we need to combine this with like HDI. Number 3, I shall say that the United Nations has developed, they have developed on a regular basis the disaster index. So how we accommodate this disaster index in our in our knowledge system. That's point 3. Point 4, German Watch, being a non-government organization, they also have developed some kind of index. We also need to think about that. 5, recently, for last few years, I shall say the Kate Raworth, she has developed a book on donut economics that actually says that the social foundation, means the work we are doing at our national and local level, the developments, these social foundation must not exceed the ecological ceiling. This is a new kind of economic thinking in the areas of in the discipline of economics. So we need to think on that as well. So number 6 is the world. Salim, in 1 minute I'll close.
Last one.
The World Economic Forum, they also develop some kind of index. We need to consider them. Finally, the last point is, by this time, I would like to mention 3 names. Al Gore in his book, The Future, Joseph Stiglitz, and Thomas Piketty. These 3 persons have provided some kind of intellectual basis for the political platform we need to think about in the future to save the human civilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mukhtar, for that excellent presentation and for the reminders of the theoretical underpinning of what we're talking about as well. Very well done. I'll just pick up on the major input that we got from Mukhtar, which is a focus on youth. In our region here in South Asia, Nigel, we are blessed with very large young population, which is a huge asset that unfortunately we are not tapping as much as we can or not investing in as much as we should. which I think is a major operation. Naturally, being a professor in a university, I work with young students all the time, and they are the best and the brightest. They are no less than any young people anywhere in the world. But we are not being able to utilize that energy and intellect that they possess and invest in it to be able to look to the future. To me, that's one of the other big gaps that is something that we can address. And it isn't, again, about money. We have money, we're educating them. We're just not educating them the right way. And so we need to change the way we're doing things. Which now brings me to our final panelist on this panel, which is our very good friend Sheila Patel, who is based in Mumbai in India. And she is the director of the Society for Promotion of Area Resource Centers, or SPARC, but has been for many, many years the head of the Slum Dwellers International, which is a very big network of slum dwellers in hundreds of slums around the world. And she's also a commissioner of the Global Commission on Adaptation, and a very close ally. She and I have been fighting the fight together for a long time. Sheila, you have the floor. 5 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Salim. And Nigel, we are all going to weigh upon you to champion so many things, but we are all there behind you. So can you show my slides, please? I have 6 slides, which basically demonstrate the demand for the granular and the local to be directly connected to the broad brush and the global. So SDI, or Shack Dwellers International, this little funnel that you see on the left side, represents an institutional arrangement that allows communities to do things very locally, but seeks to impact it globally through creating awareness, strategy development, evolving and scaling, so that many locals produce the new global. That's our mantra. And therefore, communities of the urban poor are organized at the local level with women at the center, at the city level, provincial level, national level, and global level. Because in the absence of an ability to interact at all these levels, the urban poor, especially the informal working and habitat communities, are generally invisible in the design, development, and execution of what governments do for cities. Today, it is estimated that 4.2 billion people live in urban areas, of which 55% live in Asia. And out of that, globally, there are 1 billion people today living in informal settlements. And it is assumed that this is going to double, especially in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. I want you to go back to the first one, please. The first thing that I feel we seek to do is to produce an identity for every single household living invisibly in urban areas. And we do that through a documentation of our own identity and challenging national and international statistics that always club us together in large numbers, in millions and billions, to say every identity counts, every identity produces entitlements and obligations. And therefore, this is a very significant element of our work, which we challenge global institutions to accommodate. The second very important thing is there is no form of security, of living, of livelihoods for the urban poor who live marginally while they are the majority of the residents in most of our cities. Next slide, please. And therefore, next slide, please. Then the most important thing that poor communities and especially women do is to look at the kind of housing stock that they want, that they want for this process. And it started with women living in informal settlements in Mumbai, designing a house that grew horizontally instead of vertically, with different forms of building materials that they developed, and And in 2000, when the MDGs were designed, they took that design to the UN. And this last one is the model of that house in an international fora, saying that poor women have design capacities, strategy capacities, and must be looked at when designing programs, because today most of the houses that governments build don't work for poor people. Next slide, please. Another very important challenge, which has both climate, COVID, and day-to-day crisis for poor people, is sanitation. In large cities all over the world, they're so dense you cannot have informal individual houses having toilets. So communities designed individual toilets, demonstrated it to the municipality and to international lenders like the World Bank, and produced a solution by which communities designed and managed these projects and have begun to produce these as temporary but important solutions while governments plan larger eradication of informal settlements. This is a global challenge, and in the COVID season, this has been very, very critical because most informal settlements don't have toilets. Next, Nigel, you spoke about mitigation. Can I have the next slide, please? What you have is large projects that are undertaken for improving the work of, to improve the slum areas. But most of them are done in ways that don't work for the poor. And two sets of large informal townships, one in Mumbai and one in Nairobi called Mukuru, have documented their present survived habitat and designed a new way to remodel these houses and present it to the governments so that large informal settlements can be transformed with complete and total involvement of the urban poor. Now, why am I telling you these stories? These stories are because we believe that solutions that work for the poor must involve the poor. They cannot be designed at the global level with broad brush ideas, assuming that that is going to solve the world's problem. And therefore, what we find is that through improved education, which allows these kind of things to be taught in universities, through investment in solutions that poor people produce, that increase resilience, increase their identity recognition in the city, and transform the way in which cities accommodate the reality of increased urbanization, will then be able to accommodate the challenges of climate change. Because for the urban poor, climate change is a new lens with which they look at old problems. And therefore, my work as a commissioner in this adaptation commission is to ask everybody to look at social movements of the urban poor, which have not been recognized, be they indigenous communities of tribals, be they fisher folk, be they unorganized workers, be they slum dwellers. The idea is to bring them into the high-level discussions, allow them to demonstrate what they contribute, and allow their huge networks to begin the transformation on the ground. Because you cannot transform the lives of billions of people living in 3 to 4 generation poverty without their participation. So, Nigel, we are all there to support you. We want you to help us bring these networks on the high table for dialogue and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you all of our panelists for excellent set of presentations. Before I invite Nigel to maybe share a few thoughts on this first set, let me just frame it again. I won't summarize, but I will frame what we are trying to achieve here. What we are looking at is recognition of the agency and activity, and there are many, many such actions taking place at the grassroots level across the world, and in particular in our region in South Asia, which don't get enough recognition or they aren't even known. And so one of the things that we have been doing, Sheila and I and the Huaru Commission and others participating in this call, have been trying to raise these voices. We call it voices from the front lines. And we try and link them up with, at the national level, with national governments and authorities, but at the global level as well through people like yourself. So we would like that to hopefully to be a major message that you can then convey to particularly the global community of how to be more effective in helping the most vulnerable. So, helping the most vulnerable is accepted. Nobody's against it, but it's how they do it that isn't effective. And so what we are offering is a better way of making it more effective by talking to us. And the word we use here is locally led adaptation, not just targeting poor people or vulnerable people or making them quote unquote beneficiaries of program, which is a very normal business as usual methodology for donors and international agencies, but consulting them, talking to them and involving them in the decision making. It's a slower process, but it's a better process if that can be done. And hopefully, we can count on your a high level championship of that change in paradigm of listening to the front lines before designing something for them. I'll let you share some reflections before we move on to the second panel then.
Well, thank you, Salim, and all the panelists. Just a few reflections. I mean, I'm from the global north, but I have over the last 15 years done a lot of work with a dear friend Lindsay Levin, who runs an organisation called Leaders Quest, who've done a lot of work in India and sub-Saharan Africa, in Brazil, with grassroots organisations, and so I've had I've been educated through several visits, Sheila, to informal settlements, where from complete ignorance to sit in a dwelling in an informal settlement and to be greeted with the utmost grace and humility and charm and generosity by yes, mostly women organising the community, whether with regards to mental health, with regards to sanitation. I mean, there's many issues. Has been one part of my education. So I love, for me, this is a really resounding message from all of you, the importance of seeing the vulnerable as agents of their future, not as victims of the system. Of course, in some ways they may be both, but it's a matter of emphasis, Salim, as you say, not to see people as recipients of health in a sort of passive way, but to be very much agents of their own future. So I think this is part of a global narrative which we really need to raise up. I mean, I love the idea of I mean, in my work with Women in Business, which was largely with the global private sector, I've been a big fan of the power of telling better stories to help shape the narrative. So I love the idea of voices from the front lines. Actually, next month we're launching with the TED network a very powerful partnership called Countdown, and we've been working very hard to make sure that there are real diversity of voices and experiences involved in that. And TED have a network of 3,500 TEDx organizers, including in all of your countries and cities, who are very tapped into the local network. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to build on that and make sure that the human story of agency and resilience at the front line is told through that. I love the point which Lajana made, that empowerment is, of course, a means to an end, but it's also an end in itself, in that empowerment breeds confidence, and confidence leads to agency itself. So I think I'm really struck by the consistency with which you're all talking about how the need to educate and organize, particularly the most poor, particularly women, particularly youth, so that they can be involved in decision making, they can access decision making. Mukta, I think that we could have a long conversation. I think it's an important one about the metrics. You mentioned HDI and the vulnerability index. I actually know Kate Rayworth quite well. I'm a big fan of her work. In fact, one of the things I co-founded a couple of years ago was the Science-Based Targets Network, to build on the idea of science-based targets for climate, which has now resonated really well amongst the private sector and increasingly cities. Extend that to the other planetary boundaries, and now we're actually talking with Kate about how can we build the inner ring of the donut, as Kate calls it, the social floor into those networks. The idea being that if every business and every city worked within, above the social floor and below the environmental boundaries, then we'd have a regenerative economy. And I don't know, some of you may have seen an initiative called Imperative 21, which was just launched with the B Corp and partners and the B team and NASDAQ. I mean, very unusual partners, right? And they're talking, I think, inspired by some of the intellectual framework of Stiglitz and Piketty criticizing the current model of global capitalism, which is exacerbating inequality rather than distributing the abundance that we have. The last thought I have, maybe a couple of questions, is I'm really intrigued about, and this is my background, but I've heard very little of you mention the private sector. And I remember I did a master's about 15 years ago when I my first part of my career was in the private sector, and then I come to feel really strongly that we've got these huge systemic problems, which you're all working on, and that we must find a way of deploying the power, the innovation, the skills, the networks, the balance sheets of the private sector in solving those problems, or contributing to solving those problems. And I remember the story of Cemex, one of the biggest cement companies in the world. This is about a 25-year story, when there was a global recession, and they noticed that all of their government and private sector markets dipped with the recession, but their sales into informal settlements actually remained robust. And so they issued what they called a declaration of ignorance. They said, we obviously don't understand that market. And they sent executives to go and live in those settlements for like 3 months with only one instruction, which was to not try and sell anything, but just to learn. And out of that, they discovered that there was a lot of waste in the building, and there was a lot of lack of capacity. So people had to buy material in too large numbers, so a lot of it got wasted. People didn't have the ability to store tools and materials securely, so a lot of them got stolen. They didn't have good design, so they built dwellings which weren't resilient. So I'm really intrigued as to what might the role be of the private sector in partnering in these kind of initiatives to bring this kind of skills and resources, not in a philanthropic sense necessarily, but in a partnership sense. Because clearly, if you're a cement company, then if people build dwellings with cement and not with corrugated iron and cardboard, there's a market benefit. But where are the win-wins? Because it's when we find the win-wins that everybody can lean in and be empowered to build better communities. So, and I think similarly with the comments around technology and digital equipment and skills and access to finance, what's the role of that system's role of empowered, organized women, youth, and urban poor and rural poor, connecting to local government? Where's the role the private sector plays in that? Something I haven't heard, so I'd be interested.
Great, thank you very much. We are running a bit out of time, but if anybody would like, Sheila or Prema, a minute each, if you don't mind, very quick. Sheila.
Okay. What we find, Nigel, is that when we are beginning to explore new solutions, the private sector is very impatient because they want quick results and they want it at scale. So what we find is that in the beginning, we need to go at the pace of the communities. But very quickly, we find that there is a connection between the volumes that we require and the potential of private sector to take over. So we have many examples of those which I can share with you later. But the question is, how do these things get sequenced? And what we find is that philanthropy is not what we want. We want people to come to us with new technology. So building technologies, for instance, today cement is very high carbon based materials. So what new materials? How can we use them? How can it help transform the construction work we do? We do not have those partnerships available to us to work together. So I think we need a lot of convergence to come in.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Any other panelists? Very quick comment if you wish. Rima?
Yes, can I speak?
Lajana, yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, yeah. From our experience of working with the commercial banks to leverage resources for housing for the poor community, it has started, but hasn't been very successful, or it hasn't scaled up, because there is no policy support for the private sectors, such as for the commercial banks to make investment in low-income communities, in the informal settlement or urban poor communities. So the government actually needs to formulate so that actually the commercial sector, the private sector, the banks can make actually investment. So there's a policy support must be there. So that is not happening in the context of Nepal. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Salim,
Rima, did you want to come in? Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, from India, I could say we have partnered for the last 10 years in the clean energy sector with the private sector. And some of our successful ones have reached even 100,000 households and saving a lot of biofuel, because those were fortunately co-creations. And as Sheila said, we don't want philanthropy, we want to be part of co-creating businesses. And now we're co-creating value chains in which we're looking at the milk value chain and going to scale with a private company. And it's working so far so good, because the private company has taken up the right role of investing in infrastructure which poor people cannot do. And we facilitate each one of our 2,000 members to get the animals from the government subsidy. So we've seen that it works only when it's private sector, it's the government and NGOs like us, and also the social finance or flexible finance is very much needed. So we have, I would say we have successful pilots, and going forward, we would need much more support, especially on the infrastructure front. But these sectors are energy, water, and now we're looking at milk and vegetables, which are basically essentials. There's a huge potential, Nigel, yeah, but it needs a lot of facilitation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Salim, you get from those stories, you get the sense that this is my sense, it's systems, right? It's
absolutely
NGOs organizing local communities. Sure. It's the finance sector, it's the private sector, and the government policy framework. So it's which is why I think you're all systems entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. And in fact, this entire dialogue is about linking up the different elements of the system to make them more efficient going forward. I'm being told that we're running way over time, so I'd like to move on, if everybody can agree to that, to the next panel, which the topic is now going to switch to finance. And the question is, what is needed to mobilize finance and ensure financial flows to the local level? We're talking about grassroots vulnerable communities in particular. And the Mentimeter is on. Please feel free to give your comments into the Mentimeter or in the chat box if you want to do that. We will be recording everything, and these will become part of the report to the high-level champions. So please make sure that your comments come in here, because we probably won't be able to give people the floor to talk, but do make sure that you give your inputs into this, into the Mentimeter, so we can capture it. So it's now my pleasure to move on to the second panel. And we have, again, a set of very distinguished speakers, the first of whom is going to be Afsari Begum, who is a senior specialist in disaster risk reduction in Practical Action Bangladesh. And they're doing some very innovative activities on flood forecasting and financing. Afsari, please take the floor, and if you can keep your remarks to 5 minutes, please.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you, and hello, everyone. Practical Action is a member of Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, a consortium of 9 organizations that basically works globally to improve the flood resilience. So let me start with the recent research from the Alliance. Basically from this research, it has been found that climate vulnerable countries are not receiving preferential targeting for climate finance from donors. Contrary to Article 9 of UNFCCC, which stipulates that countries particularly vulnerable to climate change and have significant capacity constraints should be prioritized. But aggregated bilateral financing data shows that the most climate vulnerable countries have only ever received between 20 and 32% of total bilateral climate change adaptation funding disbursed. So this clearly shows that there is no correlation between the amount of money received for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction by people living in extreme poverty and climate vulnerability. This means funds are not being targeted according to need. This is very concerning, as we know that vulnerable countries are facing challenges of loss and damage too. If we cannot address, if there is not adequate financing, so that will actually resulting in loss and damage in the community. Climate finance is not reaching the most vulnerable country. There could be many different reasons, but one of the reasons, because donors may perceive it is too difficult to invest in low income or fragile countries, as the overall enabling environment is weak in terms of such as low government capacity with a difficulty in demonstrating fund management experience. And sometimes we also see that there is a staff turnover, in a sense like the person who is engaged in this kind of activities since long, and they move to another departments or another institutions, and along with them they actually take their experiences or expertise, because of maybe there is a systematic gap, or maybe there is some lack of systemic transformation. So as we see that in first session, panelists have emphasized the need to invest in capacity, and this is true when talking about how climate finance can reach and be used by the most vulnerable groups. If I give the example, for climate finance to be allocated and spent at the most vulnerable communities, some kind of risk assessment and governance mechanisms for reflecting community needs in budget is necessary. So this means that the community, the local government's budget, that plays an important role. Without this, it is not possible to know where to spend the money and why. This is often missing at the local government levels we work in due to governance structures that are not fully functioning. Nigel, if for your information, I can say that in Bangladesh, there's a union disaster management committees at the grassroots levels, at community levels. And these committees are basically responsible for disaster risk management at the community levels. And of course, climate adaptation is a key component of disaster management in Bangladesh. This committee's role is articulated in law and policy. However, we see that these committees are not functional in many places due to maybe some lack of time, or maybe engagement with other activities, and especially for a capacity of the members. This means the activities like risk assessment, which are very necessary to identify current risks that need financing for, are not conducted. And without needs identified, necessary activities cannot be identified either. And hence, it is difficult to have activities budgeted for adaptation and risk reduction. So this is one of the major challenge at the community level. And along with that, because local government actors often do not have sufficient knowledge on how to design or implement climate adaptations program in many cases, it is difficult for governments that work directly with the most vulnerable to decide what and how they could use finances for. Often funds are disbursed with a very top-down approach that doesn't really understand or
I'm sorry, we've just lost you.
We've lost Afsari. Anastasia, should we move on and see if she can come back?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, well, let us then move on to the next speaker, and then if Afsari reconnects, we'll try and give her the floor again. So the next speaker on this panel is Dr. Ghulam Rabbani, who is the head of the Climate Bridge Fund Secretariat in BRAC, which is the largest NGO, not just in Bangladesh, but now in the world as well. And this is a very innovative new fund that has been created, and we've asked him to share some of his experiences on that. Rabbani, you have the floor. 5 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. A great opportunity to share some of my thoughts about the major barriers to have access to global fund, and also what can be done to make sure that the financial risk is the most vulnerable. It's under two major categories. One is the strategic gap and the operational challenges that we face at two ends. One is the recipient end, and the other one is the sender or supplier end. When I mean the when I say about the recipient end, I actually mean the developing countries and the vulnerable communities, and the sender and suppliers are the developed world, or the different funds, global international funds, and the donor countries. So two ends. Well, some of the points that I'd like to mention here is the three major words. One is the communication, sender or supplier. So what do we communicate from the recipient end to the supplier end? For example, the needs and priorities of the vulnerable communities, whether we are rightly communicating to them and the sender them, so that they can integrate this in their 5 years, 10 years long strategy to make sure that the fund goes really well to the vulnerable communities. So that is my one point. My second point is the capacity building, or the capacity, what the need of the implementing partners, and the implementing partners are basically need the government agencies and also the non-government, so that they can in the rural areas really well to the one point. My second point is to make sure that they are capacity, the government agencies and new adaptation technologies. For example, in the agriculture sector, we are getting new varieties, and the farmers are very well known about their 20 years long, 30 years long learnings from their parents. But if we get the new adaptation technology in the agriculture sector, how do they take this technology to the field, and they cultivate their different varieties? So these new technologies, they need the capacity building in particular. So there are other issues that we can talk about, but the capacity building, both supplier and the country, they can take measures to make sure that the NGOs and the state and non-state actors are capacitated. My third point is the transparency and accountability. Is always we debate that the transparency and accountability will be maintained by the recipient end, and there is a debate, and we discuss always that there is a double counting issue, triple counting issue at the supplier end as well. So this has to be also maintained, so that we have the highest level of transparency and accountability.
Rabbani, you're breaking up. I suggest you turn your video off and see if the sound is better. Turn your camera off.
And regarding the media or what can be done to ensure this, the number one message is whether we are rightly communicating the vulnerabilities and the adaptation solutions to the supplier end. And the second point is, supplier end has to make sure that I would like to mention is the development partners has to put some efforts to build the capacity. And my last point, I understand the time, but my last point would be, let us identify some of the deprived issue. Professor Salimul Haq was talking about the urban, one of the area where, there are a lot of debates going on at the national level and also at the urban level, that we are not really focusing urban adaptation, in different countries, in the different vulnerable areas. And in recently, where I'm currently heading the Climate Bridge Fund Secretariat, we are taking these urban adaptation issues and we are trying to support the NGOs to initiate adaptation actions for the climate-induced migrants and the poor vulnerable issues. And this climate bridge fund was established by BRAC and KFW. And this is first year 2020 we started, and in next 4 years we will continue our support to implement adaptation actions in the urban areas. Thank you so much, Salim sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rabbani. Apologies for cutting you off. Your sound was not very good. We see Afsari is back. Would you like to take a minute to just finish your recommendations? Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I was like, I don't know actually how far you have listened to me, but I'm just coming to my recommendation part.
Go to your final recommendations, exactly.
Yes, sir. Basically, to ensure the climate vulnerable countries receive adequate adaptation funding, I have 3 recommendations. Number 1 recommendation is donors need to rethink funding strategies which are not procured and are not based on measures of need that prioritizes countries where the impacts of the climate crisis is most severe. As the challenges facing the most vulnerable countries in terms of receiving and implementing funding are documented, donors should support capacity building of national governments so they can absorb needed adaptation financing better. Second recommendation is basically the Standing Committee on Finance of the UNFCCC should report on how donor funds overlap with climate vulnerability of those most in need and present findings annually at COP to increase attention and pressure on the donors to meet their commitments and the intent of the Paris Agreement. And the third recommendation is the commitments by bilateral and multilateral donors, including the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and by national government should include detailed plans for how they will increase funding for local level authorities, organizations, and communities, and how funds will reach the most vulnerable populations. And to ensure the most vulnerable communities receive adequate adaptation funding, I have 2 recommendations. One is multilateral and bilateral donors need to take a long-term and holistic approach to fragile and vulnerable countries, especially capacity building and governance strengthening, which will take time but help other development goals simultaneously. Donors should consider developing adaptation compacts with the particular. And the final last point is financing mechanism need to be reformed to strengthen the decision-making power of affected people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Afsari. Sorry to cut you off. We are now racing against the clock, so I'm going to move on to our next panelist, who is Manjeet Dakal from Nepal. Manjeet is an old friend. He's the head of the LDC support team of climate analytics, but also a very long time negotiator on behalf of the least developed countries group in the global negotiations at the COPs, and in particular, one of the key negotiators on the topic of loss and damage, which is not the topic of today's discussion here, but it is something that is going to have to be dealt with in COP26 as well. Manjeet, you have the floor. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Salim. So I'll quickly move on the point as we have very limited time. I'm asked to shed light on 2 key points. One, the context in the global negotiation the discourse related to adaptation financing. I'll try to link it with the regional context, and we'll share one example from Nepal, how the experience from Nepal in mobilizing finance at the subnational level. In terms of the global negotiation, obviously, the ambition has been a buzzword, ambition in terms of mitigation, adaptation. I was hearing the discussion closely earlier, some of the intervention that relates to the need of adaptation financing. Obviously, it's difficult to aggregate the amount of finance need, but it has been evident that there remain a gap between the finance that is available and the finance that is required to implement action. There has also been a call in terms of balancing the finance for adaptation and finance for mitigation. We discuss about the role of the private sector. We discuss how they can be instrumental, but where are the barriers as well. And on all this, Salim, as you said, there remains a residual impact. The science has proven that the loss and damage will be evident. So that finance, that's a big discussion. As you said, I will not go deep on this. So in terms of the global negotiation, there are discussion about the 100 billion goal. There are discussion about the new collective quantitative financial goal and the finance to make it consistent with the path towards the low greenhouse gas emission and the climate resilient development. There are also the broader discussion about the debt relief. There are also broader discussion about the resilient recovery. I think all this helps very much in terms of South Asia context, the South Asia, the region which is vulnerable to climate impacts, the diverse city that we have, which has been already discussed in the first panel. I was just picking some of the example from the fund that are established under the UNFCCC process. If I just pick an example of Green Climate Fund, which have committed 143 projects as of now. I was looking at the number, of which 25% of the funding is dedicated to adaptation. Among these 143, 18 are from South Asian countries. And it's interesting to see that among these 18, 14 are focused on adaptation related project. Few of them may be cross-cutting, but more on the adaptation and the resilience building. There are 11 direct access accredited entities from South Asia. And it's interesting to see that not all of these are from the government entity. Some of these are the private banks. Some of these are the other entities that works bringing together the diverse stakeholder. The one other example in relation to the GCF I found very interesting from Pakistan is Pakistan has a national board for the GCF, which brings together a diverse multi-stakeholder to help with the GCF process at the national level. So, Salim, Nazel, as you have been saying earlier, it's not only the vulnerable perspective. It's not only that we are poor, we are impacted, but I think we can also share to the world the best example that we have done in the region. Three quick recommendation specific to South Asia. There is a need of greater support to build the institutional capacity to access finance and helping the national institution, the government institution, so that their fiduciary risk and the safeguard are standard. One of the initiatives that Salim is also involved, I'm working with him, is the universities network. And I think here the universities can play a big role. And that initiative has already started in South Asia. For the least developed country group, we have an initiative called Least Developed Country Consortium called LOC. The second recommendation would be the express demand for the technical assistance on the challenge in terms of proposal development, the challenge in terms of the project not only remain at the project level, but goes beyond, and the need of regional knowledge management and the learning from all this experience. And here the role of the non-state actor, the institutions in the region will be very crucial. The third recommendation in terms of the finance would be look for the innovative finance, the co-financing that are required when the government have to submit proposals. And here the private sector, the non-government organization, the philanthropic and the other investor can play a big role helping the government to access this funding as a means to co-financing. So very quickly, I'll move to the second part, setting an example from Nepal in terms of mobilizing finance, so resources at the local level. I'll just pick one example called LAPA. Salim, you have already shed a light on this, also Lazanazi earlier. And Salim, as you said, we only doesn't have a LAPA, but NAPA, but also a NAPA. So NAPA, which is more a plan that is built at the national level, but we have tried to engage stakeholder to form a local level planning. I was hearing the discussion earlier, I think as Sila Patel said, the plan action should not only be designed at the global level, the local people should be engaged in terms of planning process. So LAPA itself is not a plan. LAPA is a framework which has envisioned local stakeholder engagement to prepare a plan when they themselves will be engaged much in the implementation phase. It is so the government of Nepal recognized adaptation as one of the emerging issue during the NAPA process, and in 2011 they endorsed the local adaptation plan of action, the framework that helps to take the adaptation measure and to enhance the resilience of the local and the vulnerable community. This also helps to implement the vision that has been set in the climate change policy in Nepal, that 80% of the fund should be disbursed at the local level. Only the 20% should be used at the national or the sub-national level. So LAPA also helps. It is also the bottom-up and the inclusive approach to help create a local ownership in terms of preparation of plan, but not only limiting to the preparation, also implementation and the engagement of the local community in terms of monitoring the plan as well. So as of now, more than hundreds of such plans has been developed. Some of them are in implementation phase, and some are still ongoing. But just to conclude, this provides, I think, one of the best example, a lesson learned, how to engage local stakeholder, how to engage a local academic institution, how to engage a private sector at the local level in development plan, and how the government can include a climate change in the development plan so that there is a system to disperse fund, and it doesn't remain only as a plan, but also implements. And again, finally, not only implements, but also there is a process to monitor it, to see where we are in terms of. So I think this is some of the example that we can share to the world, that how the local communities can be in the front line, not only as a recipient, but also someone who can share to the world in terms of best approaches and lesson learned. Thank you.
Excellent, Manjeet. Thank you very much. And we all are very proud of the LAPAs in Nepal. This is a South Asian, jewel in the crown in terms of locally led adaptation taking place anywhere in the world. So it's now my pleasure to invite our last panelist, Virender Sharma from the Asian Development Bank, who are big players in the financing of development generally, and now also on climate change in the region. Virender, you have the floor. 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Salimul. I think good to see that we are moving ahead with this event. So I'm actually going to speak about how the financing needs and approaches, how the financing needs and approaches for resilience goals are implemented by the Asian Development Bank. I think there are two distinct areas where the bank is involved with the private sector on resilience-related projects and issues. One is development of ADB projects that directly attract private sector finance, and second is where ADB invests together with the private sector. And generally, the approach is taken up by the ADB PSOD, which is Private Sector Department. And this is where we are actually providing that link to the private sector department in PSOD to build a better portfolio addressing the issues of resilience. And how we are doing this is that I'm managing the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. It's a multi-donor trust fund, largely supported by the UK government. And we are providing approach that we are using is targeted grants to incentivize demonstration of potential viable resilience actions on the ground. And this could be structured as risk reduction or risk transfer mechanisms, could be viability gap funds, or credit enhancement guarantee structures. And why we need to do this is to address the barriers. As I think speakers on the panel have already mentioned, that there are barriers, and that's what needs to be addressed. So what are the barriers? One is lack of resilience policy and planning, project development, specifically for resilience outcomes, and catalytic finance that is required. Current capital market frameworks are restricting long-term private sector funding to local government resilient infrastructure. A lack of targeted incentives for private sector returns. Returns is a big issue that the private sector looks at when it actually does the projects, and of course PPP investment in resilience projects. And the example that I want to offer is the ADB microfinance project, over the last 5 years, the project has an outreach of about 30 MFIs, microfinance institutions, about 1 billion in co-financing through partner MFIs, and reaching about 5 million micro borrowers. How do we actually extend the reach of this program to reach the poor and the most vulnerable? And that's where, how do we support them to develop micro insurance products for resilient housing, water and sanitation for the urban and the peri-urban poor? Here, the UCCRTF grant, first of all, helps in de-risking the investment. So what we provide is the first loss cover, a longer tenure of the loan, micro loan that we are talking about, given that the private sector environment doesn't have that. And then, of course, a revolving fund where the capital moves. And this is targeted at housing microfinance. Important is the TA, the technical assistance that we are providing through advisory services from Habitat for Humanity to build skills and capacity. So if you really want looking at resilient livelihoods and resilient outcomes, then I think this combination of this financial and also capacity and skills is important. Also to mention that UCCRTF is supporting Oxfam for community-led projects. This is the largest CSO contract in ADB in 9 cities and 4 countries, helping in co-design and co-creation of local and community-based solutions for resilience. Important is that ADB loans are actually active in those cities, and that's where we are doing it. But perhaps the loans are leaving out some of the peri-urban communities, informal settlements, because they're not part of the formal city. And this is where I think we come in with the sector-focused and area-focused area, looking at poor and vulnerable and building this whole co-creation and co-design with the communities. I think another example I want to give is the ADB's trade finance program, a very interesting program, a very quick, provides guarantees and loans to about 240 partner banks in 21 countries, and about 20,000 SMEs are supporting about 25 billion co-financing. So that's the scale that ADB operates in. How do we ensure that these trade finance transactions involving SMEs dealing with textiles, oils, food processing, etc., integrate environmental, social safeguards, labor, health, and climate change resilience issues in that? That's what, even given the short nature of transactions, we are ensuring that UCCRTF works with the trade finance program and does this. I finally move to my conclusion, and this is again a message for the high-level champions. I think financing needs and approaches for building resilience really need to address the conventional barriers that are listed above and provide very structured and tailored financial solutions, which are coupled with technical assistance and capacity and skill services. And that's the way to actually open up this whole sector. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Virender, for that excellent set of recommendations as well. So we are coming towards the end, and we are sort of running against the clock, as I said. So we had hoped we would have opportunity for more sort of Q&A from participants, but unfortunately there won't be time for that. But there is an opportunity for you to give your input. So please use the Mentimeter to answer or provide your inputs on the previous 2 questions, which are still open, and also a new question, a new opportunity, which is one message that you would like to give to the high-level champions to take forward. And everybody gets to give one message in the Mentimeter. So please do that. In the meantime, before we conclude, I will give the floor to Nigel as the high-level champion to share some concluding thoughts. We may not have time for people to answer your questions, Nigel, but you can certainly put them on the table for us to maybe have a future dialogue back with you on. And before we conclude, we are very fortunate to have with us Ambassador Ken O'Flaherty, who is the COP26 envoy for this region, for Asia Pacific, which includes our region, South Asia, and we'll be asking him to give us a few concluding remarks, particularly focusing on the way forward towards COP26 and what will happen in COP26. So before I invite Ken to speak, let me give the floor to Nigel for some rounding up thoughts from your side. Nigel.
Well, again, Salim, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. Really informative and helpful. And I'll be brief to leave Ken the majority of the time. I mean, again, I'm hearing very loudly from you all the importance of local actors being involved in the financing discussion as well as the planning of projects. I think very loud and clear that capacity building and technical assistance have to go hand in hand in order to unlock financial flows from whichever source, right? I mean, if there's not the skills to put together the project proposals or to have the governance in place to do the risk assessments, for example. I think I'm really encouraged to hear some good examples of co-financing of interesting partnerships between sort of multilateral institutions, local government, NGOs on the ground, and even private finance. I do think, I really think this. So I think telling stories of what's working seems to be really important, because whether in mitigation or in resilience, if something's already working, it's proof that it's possible. And often the barrier is that people don't believe something's possible or that it will work. I think if you only got to look at the history of microfinance as an example of that, you know, when it was a new idea, it was impossible. Now that it's a very familiar idea, it's much easier to attract more money towards that. I do have a sense that we're still, there's still a struggle to hear the whole story of, based on, I think, need and agency, and then the path to execution. And I think this is something I'm really keen to do, is to not get stuck on the 100 billion. I know it's really important and it has to be deployed well, but I want to try and find the whole story. So if we take a country like Bangladesh, for example, what's the overall kind of resilient investment need? You know, what percentage is multilateral, what is local, what is private, how do they all work together? Because I think that then is a more empowering narrative than, of which then part is the 100 billion plus and the transparency around that, but it's a more empowering narrative. So I'm keen to hear some of the examples that, I mean, I think, and it's nice to finish on Verinda, because then we've heard a lot of the very locally led empowering initiatives, and then Verinda talks about some very big, more top-down, but like the UCCRTF. I get that. That's a nice long acronym you've got there, Verinda. How that is seeking to bridge between, if you like, the trillions and local communities. And I think finding ways of telling those stories and taking those examples to scale locally and internationally is something that I'm really keen to see how Gonzalo and I and the whole Marrakesh Partnership community can help. So with that, I'd just like to say final thank you. For me, in terms of my main objective being to be educated, mission absolutely accomplished, and not just educated, but really inspired by so many great examples of your individual and collective leadership. So thank you, Salim, and all the speakers. And with that, I'll hand over to Ken.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nigel, for those. Before I give the floor to Ken, let me just take a minute or two to share my final sort of takeaway messages for you, Nigel. And I'll try not to repeat the earlier ones I made. So one of the things in the finance sector that you mentioned, in our case in Bangladesh, you know, the government of Bangladesh has taken climate change seriously for quite some time now. And in the last few years, in the national budget, we have been allocating, our finance minister has been allocating resources for tackling climate change in the national budget. And in the last budget for this year, 8% of the national budget, which is a very considerable amount of money, has been allocated across 25 ministries of the government of Bangladesh to tackle climate change. So we're not sitting and waiting for this mythical 100 billion to come and arrive here. We're using our own money to do things which we think are needed to be done. The second point I'll make is that you may be aware that Bangladesh, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, has recently taken over as the president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a political forum of vulnerable countries, nearly 50 of them. And under that forum, they also have a finance ministers group called the V20 group. It's not 20 members, it's all almost 50 members, but it's the finance ministers. And finance ministers don't go to negotiations, they don't go to COPs, but they control their own budgets. And they're allocating money in their own budgets to tackle climate change because it's a serious threat. It's reality. It's not about negotiating something anymore. It's about dealing with the reality of climate change in these vulnerable countries. So we are taking it very, very seriously. And our finance ministers are putting the money where their mouth is in terms of allocating those resources that are needed. Obviously, we also will negotiate for more resources from the global level, but we are not waiting for that to happen. And I think through the high-level champions, where you can bring other actors than the negotiators together, that's really where we need to be going. We need to be going into the action space as opposed to the negotiating space where we've been living for too long now. The negotiating space, important as it is not the action space. The action space is reality on the ground. And I see, hopefully, one of your roles would be to connect those different realities of the negotiations and the people doing things on the ground.
Right.
With that, I'd love to hand over to Ken to give us some concluding remarks. Ken, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salim. And I very much agree with you that this is a very real, a very pressing challenge, and we are seeing governments across the world taking very strong action. As COP presidency, we know that climate change more widely affects lives, it affects livelihoods, it reshapes economies, landscapes, and communities. And I've heard some really fantastic examples of exactly how that happens here today. As presidency, we are determined to press forward action to adapt to the impacts of climate change, to build long-term resilience, to build less vulnerability, and to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage as quickly as possible across all scales and across all sectors. We have heard, and indeed the world has seen, how South Asia has really suffered from unprecedented impacts from climate change over recent years, not least the deadly floods and monsoons that have affected India, Nepal, and Bangladesh in recent years. I would like to point out Bangladesh in particular as a recognized leader in responding to disasters, in disaster preparedness as well. The effectiveness of Bangladesh's early warning systems and other measures is very clear from the drastic reduction in mortality rates from cyclones. If you compare the hundreds of thousands of deaths from these events in the 70s to less than 100 in 2019. We are clear that the international community needs and to learn from examples such as that of Bangladesh. The international community, including development, humanitarian, climate, environment, private, public, and community actors, all have to unite to do more to develop early warning systems, reduce vulnerability, and take anticipatory action to prevent climate-linked disasters. And I've been very clear in my engagement, and it was good to hear it reinforced today, that the role of women and the role of youth will be important in that process, and we must give them rather the resources to adapt. For the UK presidency and through our adaptation and resilience campaign, we want to make progress in 3 areas. First of all, we want to increase the availability and accessibility of adaptation finance through both public and private sources, as Nigel and others have been saying. We in the UK have not just committed to doubling our global climate finance, but also to ensure that half of that climate finance goes towards adaptation and resilience. And we are pressing other companies to take a similar approach. I've heard what Nigel and others have said about the 100 billion target. I think we are clear and we must meet that target, and we must go beyond that target. We will be using our presidency to encourage improvements to accessibility of A&R finance from all sources, such as the GCF and GEF. Secondly, building on the call for action and on adaptation and resilience that was adopted and endorsed by 118 countries and over 80 organizations at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019, and we have to drive forward and showcase tangible on-the-ground actions. We want those actions to improve climate adaptation and build resilience, both at local level and at national level. And I think we've heard some really excellent examples of that in this meeting today from a wide range of different sources. We in the Foreign Office and our our ex-Foreign Office and our ex-DFID colleagues, so in the new FCDO, are working closely with Nigel and with the high-level champions team to develop a campaign that builds on the political ambition and momentum created through the call for action on adaptation and resilience. This campaign will focus on delivering those on-the-ground actions, driving future ambition, and we very much want to cover actions by both parties and non-party stakeholders. Finally, we want to improve response and preparedness to climate-related disasters. The UK is a partner in the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, REAP, which brings together development, climate and humanitarian actions, and we want to be working with donor countries to expand early action financing to improve early warning systems and to build capacity to act on risks. We're collaborating, for example, with the government of India and several other countries on the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI. The CDRI is aiming to promote research and knowledge sharing in the fields of infrastructure risk management, standards, financing, and recovery mechanisms. Finally, I'd just like to say I've really heard the message that it's not just about finance, that we do need to consider the real impact on people. We need to be working together to address these issues across a range of sectors and a range of scales. So we very much see this as a holistic approach, bringing public, private sector, but also NGOs and other actors together to build action in this field. It's been really informative for me to be hearing the findings of this event today. And I'd very much want to finish with the message that the UK COP presidency wants to provide a global platform to showcase solutions and opportunities in ANR and to advocate greater international effort to put those solutions into practice. Thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you very much, Nigel. Before we absolutely conclude, I'm going to invite all the panelists to turn your cameras on for a minute so we can have a screenshot of everybody. Please turn your cameras on. And what will happen next is that this is one of a set of regional dialogues that are taking place. And as everybody is, I'm sure, quite well aware, the COP itself has moved by a year to November 2021. But this November 2020, there will be a set of dialogues going on virtually as well. And so all of these regional dialogues, I understand, will be culminating into that November dialogue of the sort of the time slot of COP26, but the old time slot rather than the new time slot. And we can then continue to keep the momentum going, even though COP itself is postponed by a year. We don't want to lose momentum for a whole year, and I'm glad that the UK presidency has decided to take this action so that we can continue to do this over the course of this November as well. So let me thank everybody, and particularly I'd like to thank my colleagues in ICAD and GRP and Waru Commission and the others who've spent quite a lot of time in organizing, designing, and having rehearsals for this meeting. I'm certainly personally very happy with the outcome. I hope Nigel is happy with the outcome as well, and that we can take this forward. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.